the amount of bipartisanship in DC is highly underrated. In the news, you will hear both sides chipping at each other, being very antagonistic and conflictual. But then if you look beneath the surface and think about what has Congress actually gotten done, they far surpassed even my expectations going into the Biden administration of how much bipartisanship could happen.
I love that idea about allowing non-government people to cycle in.
Instead of joining one side and pulling harder in that direction, hoping to win a lateral tug of war, what you should actually do is grab the rope in the middle and pull sideways. To actually make things happen, you have to be meeting privately with folks, with staff in Congress. If you as a think tank are able to influence what the subject matter experts and elite decision makers view about a topic, you could have real change.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another episode of Infinite Loops. You know, if you listen to this podcast at all, that I'm very much in favor of progress and innovation and all these great things. And it seems odd that we need to have institutions to be in favor of this, but I'm delighted that we do. My guest today is Alec Stapp, the co-founder and co-CEO of the Institute for Progress in Washington, D.C. And essentially, Alec, you guys are advocating policy prescriptions and help with members of Congress and other organizations running these regulations and laws to accelerate scientific, technology, industrial progress. You add something, though, that I find interesting, while safeguarding humanity's future. Welcome, Alec.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Excited to be here.
So let's get right into it. Tell us about the Institute. What made you decide, you know what, we need to have a policy institute to convince these Congress critters to do the right thing?
Yeah, so my co-founder, Caleb Watney, and I, we decided to start the Institute for Progress a little more than 2 years ago now. Quit our jobs at a previous think tank 2.5 years ago, launched publicly almost exactly 2 years ago. And both of us have been in DC for a good number of years now. Caleb, my co-founder, has been here for almost a decade working in policy. We both worked at a handful of think tanks across the ideological spectrum, both center-left and center-right, primarily on technology policy and innovation policy. And we had great experiences at every organization we worked at, but we were increasingly of the belief going into 2021, that time period, that it was time for new institutions, and there was really a hunger and an appetite for it. And that the existing paradigm in the think tank ecosystem had kind of become outdated. A lot of the major institutions you hear about in terms of the Brookings Institution, AEI, Heritage, they all have some great people working at them, but they are creatures of a different era, especially a different information ecosystem. And so we thought, while we had a great experience working at other organizations across the political spectrum, that if you could start from a clean slate, select new issue areas that were neglected, important, and ideally tractable as well, you can make much more progress. You could hire superstars from day one, remain a small and nimble team, outsource a lot of the back office work at think tanks that's traditionally done by a large operational staff. And if you can just maintain a laser focus on what are the core policy areas you're working on with an amazing group of policy experts, and really keeping the North Star of counterfactual policy impact. We as a think tank exist to change the policy in DC in the areas we work on. And a lot of other think tanks, though they do great work, they're often focused on delivering tangible outputs for their donors, because the donors themselves have a principal agent problem where for any person making a decision on, do I donate $100,000 to this think tank, whether it's a foundation or a corporation, they often want a white paper or an event or some other kind of publicly legible thing they can say, for our money, we got this. And we had a 3-year program on food stamps or something. But maybe during that period of time, food stamps weren't even in the Overton window for being reformed in DC, but they got a donation from a foundation years ago to work on this, and they have to work on it. By contrast, our approach is we have a small number of donors who give us general support and trust our mission and theory of change to work on innovation policy broadly and find out the most tractable ways of actually changing things on the ground. And so that was just really exciting prospect, and decided to quit our jobs and have a go of it.
I love the fact that it's one of the parts of our theme of the Great Reshuffle that a lot of our old institutions are getting very creaky, and that oftentimes the best thing to do is do what you did. In other words, just say, let's reimagine this. Let's take advantage of the tools and technologies of today, and not be bound by either the antiquated method or methodologies or systems or whatever. And all of, as you mentioned, the inherent drag of all of the old donors wanting their ideas addressed as well. Did you think about trying to reform the institutions that you were within before deciding, no, we're just going to go and have a laser focus on what we want to and what we believe is absolutely critical at this stage of our society's development?
Yeah, so we definitely tried to do some change from within the system, and had, again, good experiences and learned a lot about how the policy process works, how you can theoretically make change happen, and just learned a lot about the technology and innovation policy ecosystem in Washington, D.C. But the thing we increasingly were kind of butting up against was the idea of, at multi-issue think tanks that cover a wide array of issues that have been around for multiple decades, the leadership of those organizations, and this is true across a majority of the think tanks in DC, not just the ones that Caleb and I worked at, is that, they had these leaders engaged in policy fights in the 90s and 2000s that they still have skin in the game. And so if you come in as the new person saying, hey, let's reverse our position on this and come out in favor of something drastically different, well, they bled for that previous position. They're not willing to do so, and understandably so. And also, if you think, well, these other issue areas that aren't innovation and tech policy, healthcare policy, tax policy, other areas of policy, if those make it harder to do your job, it's harder to focus on a narrow issue when a think tank covers a broad array of topics, harder to make allies and coalitional partners. And so by starting from a clean slate, we could do our own set of policy positions from day one and stay laser focused on how we drive innovation policy forward. DC is obviously a very partisan place these days, but there are certain neglected areas or underrated areas that do have a lot of bipartisanship. And we think science and innovation policy is one of those areas. And so by avoiding, we don't do anything on the culture war topics. We completely stay out of those fights. We try to focus on what are the positive sum issues that really can advance through Congress in a bipartisan fashion, or should be higher priorities for the administration. If it's an executive branch action, we think there's a lot of latitude to actually make real progress in policy in those areas. But legacy institutions, due to both sclerosis, like you were talking about, but also due to they've just taken positions over decades that are hard to reverse. And we thought a new institution wouldn't have those same issues.
Yeah. And one of the things you say is that progress is a policy choice. I found that sentence very, very interesting. So help me by elaborating on that idea for our listeners and our viewers.
Yeah, and this is kind of, I think, part of our fitting with our can-do spirit, optimism about the potential for change in Washington, D.C. But you see in so many areas, especially, this is why, as an institution, we focus on U.S. federal policy. We think local and state policy can matter, but in general, federal policy is more important. We think there's great people doing work on international policy. But if you want the biggest bang for your buck as a policy wonk, as someone who's working in this field, U.S. federal policy is the largest lever you possibly can have. And so if you care about basic R&D, the two largest funders of R&D in the world are here in Washington, D.C. It's the NIH and NSF. They collectively fund tens of billions of dollars of basic R&D. And the incentives they create for scientists, academics, research institutions dramatically shape what gets worked on and what kinds of innovations we get, and what the top of the funnel looks like for commercialization that's happening by startups and other private entities further down the funnel. And so we think it's the largest leverage point. The U.S. is also a world leader in innovation. Things that happen in the United States spill over to other countries. A lot of other countries copy policy decisions that the United States makes. They copy the FDA in terms of drug regulation. They copy lots of different areas where they see the U.S. as a world leader. And so progress as a policy choice means the policy decisions made in Washington, D.C. dramatically affect the pace of progress around the world. And so we think as a small team with about 15 people now, this is the largest lever we have in the world to make change happen.
One of the things that I've seen kind of happening to my dismay is the ideological camps are hardening, it seems to me. And so you mentioned that you're trying to work across the aisle, which I applaud. I think if you can get both sides of the aisle excited about something, that's going to be probably a better chance of actually having a change in policy. But for example, when talking about things like re-engaging on nuclear power or elemental power, as some are rebranding it, and or the mRNA vaccines, I personally used to be, just like everyone else, anti-nuclear until I started actually looking into the facts. And I thought, oh my God, I've been wrong for quite a while here. And I was very much in favor of the mRNA. Now, the reason I picked those two is the left-leaning side might still be very anti-nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
The right-leaning side, from what I've seen on social media and elsewhere, could be very suspicious and anti-mRNA platform type technologies. How do you thread that needle?
Yeah. So first, I'll preface my answer by saying I think the amount of bipartisanship in DC is highly underrated, especially in the last few years. In the news, you will hear both sides chipping at each other, being very antagonistic and conflictual. So there definitely is an element of extreme partisanship. But then if you look beneath the surface and think about what has Congress actually gotten done, they far surpassed even my expectations going into the Biden administration of how much bipartisanship could happen, especially the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, $50 billion in subsidies to reshore advanced chip manufacturing in the United States. Recently, just this week, a $80 billion bipartisan tax deal just passed the House by overwhelming margin, trading an expanded child tax credit for full expensing for R&D by private companies. That's a win-win in my book, and likely has a good chance of passing the Senate. That's in an election year. So I think a lot of this stuff doesn't make the news in the same way that the culture war issues do, but there is still major legislation going through Congress. And then in terms of, you mentioned nuclear and mRNA vaccines, I think obviously, there's a partisan balance to those two topics. But one thing I'll say is this is where technocracy and having an elite theory of change really matters, which we do, which is that the median voters' view on nuclear power is very abstract. They have a general vibes-based approach of, do I think nuclear feels safe, or does it feel exciting? And then I'll kind of roughly be pro or anti more regulation on nuclear. But the more you learn about each policy area in DC, you realize that they're incredibly complex and have thousands of different dimensions on which to set policy. And no one has the time, energy, or expertise to follow these things very closely. And so there's so much room for maneuvering. So for nuclear, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the minute decisions they make on a day-to-day basis add up to a lot. But the average voter, I think, isn't following that. It doesn't really influence their decision-making. And so if you as a think tank are able to influence what the subject matter experts and elite decision makers view about a topic, you could have real change without actually, needing to worry too much about the partisanship on a given topic. And then similarly with mRNA vaccines, I think that's a topic where I think the most controversial thing about the vaccines is actually the vaccine mandates. But if you just take a step back and say, what we want to do is accelerate development of safe and effective vaccines that are made available to as many people who want them as possible. We, IFP, as a think tank, and lots of our partners have no opinion on whether a mandate is good or not. People can yell and argue about that. But the positive sum abundance mindset that is relatively uncontroversial is that it's better to have more treatments and medicines available to people who want them. And if you just stay at that level, I think it's much easier to make progress.
And then do you help the various legislatures and regulators with reframing issues? Because ultimately, at least on the people who get elected side, they're going to have to win the hearts and minds of their constituents. Do you offer helpful ways that they can reframe something that is like, again, nuclear? It is getting reframed, right? And it's happening slowly. But like, do you ever face a situation where you're sitting with a congressperson and they're like, yes, I'm totally in favor of this, but no, my constituents will like throw me out of office? How do you respond to that kind of challenge?
Yeah, you hear that kind of thing all the time, especially because oftentimes elected officials understand what the quote unquote right policy is, or the policy that at least will grow the pie the most or lead to the most innovation, but due to political reasons are hesitant to take a certain position. I think the majority of our advice, and we do much more behind the scenes than the average think tank in DC. That's, again, part of our theory of change, is that to actually make things happen, you have to be meeting privately with folks, with staff in Congress, with people in the federal agencies, identify champions who already agree with you, but are under-resourced and need more technical expertise, more help, need potentially cover publicly to take the kind of decisions they already want to take. So that's our general theory of change, is to stay very close to them and try to be as helpful as possible when we have a champion who agrees with us. But in terms of if they're worried about the politics and the optics, the main way we try to frame things is focus on outcomes. So when it comes to nuclear power, the average voter is much more concerned about the cost of electricity in their home, like actual cost of living, kitchen table type issues. What are grocery prices? What are fuel costs? Things like that really make them feel like things are going in a better or worse direction generally. And so I'd say, again, nuclear is not the type of issue that animates many voters as like their number one priority, but cost of living is usually in the top 3 when you poll voters. And so we would emphasize to policymakers, focus on the outcome. Nuclear energy is an instrument to cheaper, abundant energy that increases standards of living across the United States, including for people in your jurisdiction and your district or your state. And that usually helps them think about, okay, actually, this could help me, if we make those investments today, those policy reforms today, in 2 years or 6 years when I'm up for re-election, I could actually have something tangible to deliver to voters.
Great reframe. How does a smaller organization like yours, how do you even go up against the lobbyists who, like, as you know, many of the so-called bills that are written, I'm doing air quotes for our listeners here, by members of Congress are in fact written almost entirely by the lobby that wants that particular legislation passed. It's kind of a David and Goliath. Like, do you have anything other than the rock and the slingshot?
Yeah, I'll borrow a quote here from Robin Hanson, I believe, is where you can think about policy fights as tug of war between two sides. And instead of joining one side and pulling harder in that direction, hoping to win a lateral tug of war, what you should actually do is grab the rope in the middle and pull sideways. So if you are working, kind of in an orthogonal fashion to the current policy debates, or at least working on topics that are neglected and there aren't many people currently fighting about them, you have a much greater chance of success. And so I'll give you a couple examples here. One is, I mentioned the tax deal that's going through Congress, the $80 billion tax deal for an expanded child tax credit in exchange for full expensing for R&D. R&D investment is obviously an innovation policy issue area, so it's relevant to IFP. But we're not actually actively working on that topic because there is such a clear business interest. So all of the relevant business lobbying groups are highly engaged in that topic. The marginal impact of IFP joining those conversations is not very large. It's not the best use of our limited resources as a small but mighty team. By contrast, if you look at science funding, and so our meta science team does a lot of work with NIH and NSF, and there are lobbying groups around those topics, and usually it's the university lobbying groups that are arguing for just more funding, just increase the top line budgets for NIH and NSF, and in general, we basically agree with that. And then there are small government, libertarian conservatives who want to just like kind of the starve the beast approach of just like, let's cut this funding. This is wasteful. Maybe it's funding ideological groups that I disagree with, but they're wanting to cut those budgets. The sideways approach that we take on that topic is we don't engage on the what should their funding levels be. It's whatever given level of funding they have, the Congress sets for them, they have an almost infinite number of different ways to spend that money. And we want to work with them and provide technical expertise to ensure that we're getting the most bang for our bucks. So whatever fixed budget NIH or NSF have, what are the reforms they could be doing to incentivize breakthrough research instead of incremental research? How do we get the contrarian ideas that will actually meaningfully improve productivity, improve living standards. And there's so much low-hanging fruit that can be much more important than whether they get a 2 or 3% total budget increase. And there's almost no groups working on that. You have no lobbyists against you. You're really just fighting the status quo at that point. And they're very excited to work with you because you're trying to help them solve problems, and they really need a lot of help. And so the kind of expertise to the agencies is usually well received.
Yeah. You also advocate for so-called moonshot projects, which I agree with. But how would you answer a critic who is like, what about as you just mentioned, what about these smaller grants? What about all of the things that might lead to incremental, sort of slower change? Are they going to get crowded out if you guys are really successful with your advocacy for the moonshot projects?
Yes, I think this is a case where it's not necessarily zero sum. And so I think you take an example of a recent moonshot, Operation Warp Speed, right? That was not a traditional budget line item that was, we funded Operation Warp Speed at the expense of other scientific and technological projects. It was during a crisis moment. We spent, in the end, $18 billion to fund this program that delivered multiple safe and effective vaccines in less than a year, way faster than almost any expert predicted. So we had this moonshot project that helped us end the pandemic earlier. Amazing success. I don't think that really came at the cost of other incremental reforms. It obviously built on decades of investment by NIH and other research funders into mRNA as a potential platform technology. So it built on that, but I don't think it took away from it in any kind of meaningful sense. And then I would say we can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. So if you could think about some of the reforms we're looking to do, we are partnered with NSF, and the National Science Foundation is looking to reform how they allocate grants. And the current system is basically a peer review committee. Reviewers score grants on a scale roughly, kind of 1 to 10. They average those scores, and the highest average scores get funded up to a certain threshold, and they spend all the money per year. Now, that's a decent way to fund scientific grant ideas, proposals. But, we have some evidence from the scientific literature that breakthrough ideas are by their nature contrarian. They're the kind of things that some people are very excited about, but the average person, most people would say, that sounds weird, that seems unlikely to succeed, it's novel, and I'm not familiar with it. And so novel ideas, and there's evidence on this, that they get scored lower on average because people aren't familiar with them. And so we're currently working with the National Science Foundation to pilot what elsewhere is called a golden ticket system, where reviewers are given a small number of golden tickets, kind of an anti-veto, to fund scientific grants if they have high conviction. This is kind of how venture capital works if you think about it. Like, you don't need an average of all venture capitalists to support your startup company, your big risky idea. You only need a small handful with high conviction to fund you. And so we think this kind of approach, a golden ticket approach to public funding of R&D, could lead to more breakthrough research, better, social returns on, returns on investment in public money. But we're not 100% sure. And so the approach we take is, let's follow the evidence. Let's run an experiment. Let's work closely with the agency, run a pilot program, run it as closely to a randomized control trial as possible, evaluate the results, and those results will help us build momentum for change. Because it's hard to change these big public agencies. But if you have a strong evidence base showing that your reform actually improves outcomes, you have a much better chance of achieving durable policy change.
I love that idea. And I wonder, though, how many people within those institutions, do they see it as sort of career risk by handing out, golden tickets to, some amazing things might be way in the deep end of the tail. And for like neurotypicals, that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows if you hand a golden ticket to somebody. Other people are kind of like, ooh, that guy's crazy.
Yeah.
Do you find that? And if you do, how do you help them overcome that?
Yeah, so I think there is definitely some of that involved. I think that's part of how we got to where we are today, is because there's a real political economy constraint that the agencies face of, they're in an iterated game with Congress, right? And so if they are funding things that fail at a high rate, that look embarrassing, in front of a congressional hearing, they could get their funding cut over time. And so they are trying to advance the scientific enterprise subject to this constraint. And so I think there are ways you can work with them to say, like, this is a high preference ticket. So it's not like we're giving ultimate authority to the person, but we're going to shift it in that direction a lot more. So if there's high preference for a certain grant, we'll take a much harder look at it. And then there's still some kind of guardrail or constraint around a truly embarrassing idea that just due to political constraints won't actually move the needle. But I think at the end of the day, the scientific agencies, they want to take more risks on the margin, or at least they realize that they're not happy with the status quo. I think this is how Tyler Cowen talks about the meta science enterprise, as the current system is so broken that it's basically indefensible, and even people inside the system will not defend it. They might be skeptical of any given reform of like, will that work, or is that a good idea? But if you ask them, like, does the current equilibrium we face in our scientific ecosystem, is it optimal or is it good? Almost no one will defend it. And so you can think of that in terms of pessimism of, oh man, it's so broken, so bad. How do we fix this? At IFP, we take an optimistic lens, which is if things are so bad, most change is going to be for the better. And so we can find the lowest hanging fruit, work closely with the agencies, build momentum over time. And also hopefully, and this is, folks that I know you've had on your podcast, like Jason Crawford and others working at the higher level of ideas and culture. I think we need to get to a point where we feel more comfortable with risk and with failure, because we do a lot of work on the DARPA model, having other agencies, helping them build their own in-house ARPA to hopefully mimic the success of DARPA. And it's built into their DNA that it's high risk, high reward, and that there's going to be a high failure rate. And because it's in the Defense Department, I think they've been able to get away with more than other agencies. But yeah, I think this kind of like got you at congressional hearings of, you funded the underwater shrimp treadmill thing. At the societal or culture level, we at the end of the day need to work past that and realize that every venture capitalist is not their worst investment or their best investment. It's a portfolio approach.
I love that answer. But I wonder, because it brings up all sorts of questions, like, are the individuals who populate these various institutes like NIH or the whole alphabet of them, do we have enough, let's say, I don't want to use the term controversial, but non-intuitive type thinking and acting? You brought up DARPA. DARPA was one of the first things I thought of when I came across you guys. I'm like, wouldn't it be great if we could have a DARPA model for all of these agencies? And what do you think? Is it progress happens one funeral at a time, or can these agencies and the people within them, are they sufficiently switched on that they're open to these types of approaches that you're advocating?
Yes, I think there is a lot of latent energy and potential in a lot of these agencies, and this is where really it's a search process for us, because again, our theory of change is that it's much easier to find your champions and empower them inside government than it is to persuade a large number of people to your position. And so there are a large number of people, for example, ARPA-H, so Department of Health and Human Services, they just got funding for their own ARPA called ARPA-H. And a lot of those folks, it's a new institution, so they have the opportunity to start fresh and take risks. They have the explicit mandate to have a higher failure rate than other kind of health funding organizations within government. And their leadership is very strong as well. And so working closely with them is something that we've seen a lot of success with, and identifying other leaders of relatively new programs or new offices has a much higher success rate. One other example, the CHIPS and Science Act funded something called the TIP Directorate at NSF. TIP stands for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And the leader there, Erwin Gianchani, is excellent. High risk, high reward thinker, would agree with a lot of what we're saying here. And he needs more resources. He needs help. He needs connections. He needs political cover and support for what he's already trying to do. And so we try to work closely with people like that and help them get more done. And I think under the current system, they have limited resources. They're all overworked. So they're looking for help. And there are some creative ways to get better people in government. One thing I'll flag here is the Intergovernmental Personnel Act allows people outside of government to cycle in on a temporary basis, and outside groups fund their positions so they're not subject to the GS scale. So you can pay people closer to market salaries to kind of do a tour of duty within government. And this is, I think, a critical hiring authority that we need much more of, which is the ability for federal agencies to flexibly hire the best person for a position and then empower them to actually go and make change happen, and also work with groups like us. And so I think there are ways to make change happen. It's just, it can be difficult, but it's possible.
Yeah, I love that idea about allowing non-government people to cycle in and the ability to pay them at a higher rate.
Yep.
That's going to, I think, lead to a lot more success on that part. But what about the idea, like, for example, I was reading recently a book talking about the burden of all of the morass of regulations and rules that have built up to such a point where there's such viscosity that people literally can't get anything done. An example, the teacher's manual for teachers in the New York City public school system. If you're old enough, you'll remember what phone books looked like. It is about this thick. And do we reach a point where we have to, like, I'm in favor of the idea of sunset laws, right? Where you pass a piece of legislation and it sunsets 10 years later, and if they don't renew it, it goes away. Are there other methodologies or tactics and strategies that could help? Well, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but in some way allow more agency at the individual level and not having to be swamped by, this bogon word salad that just is meant to paralyze people.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity here. I'll just make two recommendations for your listeners on works that have really influenced my thinking on this topic. The first one is Recoding America by Jen Pahlka. She has worked in multiple administrations at both the state level in California and in the U.S. federal government on implementing technology platforms within government. So she worked on a lot of different technology challenges, worked during COVID on the unemployment insurance systems in California to manage all the claims when COVID spiked unemployment. So really has been in the trenches on these topics. And her book, Recoding America, chronicles a lot of these cases, chronicles the recovery of Obamacare after the first exchange collapse. They had to bring in a whole new team and build a new website for processing Affordable Care Act applications. And Jen Pahlka's main takeaway in that book is that government civil servants need more discretion and the ability. Of course, elected officials will always be the ones to set values, goals, outcomes they want to see. But too much of kind of the kludgeocracy, sclerosis we see in government is due to proceduralism, and is kind of, the top level sets a checklist for everything that needs to happen for a given government service delivery. And then that leads to terrible outcomes, terrible products, kind of the DMV experience of interfacing with the government. And what Jim Pahlka says is, let's bring more of a Silicon Valley tech approach to this. Let's have agile workflows of teams working within government. Let's have product managers, not just project managers, who actually think about the end user, what it's like to use government services. And then what are the ways we should design these programs to maximize outcomes, not fulfilling some checklist. And the second recommendation I have for your listeners is Nick Bagley, who's a law professor at the University of Michigan, wrote a piece called The Proceduralist Fetish. And it's really this kind of like a look at American culture and legal systems that a lot of the incentives are towards proceduralism and just following a step-by-step approach that ignores outcomes or ignores end users and how it affects people on an individual level. And I think that kind of culture change will take a while, but there's definitely momentum and excitement around these ideas. I talk to lots of people in government here who read these works and are influenced by them, and they go into government, try and have a different mentality. But I think on the side of the American voter and people who are engaged with the political system, with discretion comes the risk for failure. And so we have to think about, if you actually want to empower people who work in government to have more discretion, then we have to be cognizant of the trade-off there, and not, the more we publicly lash them and criticize them for every single misstep, the less likely you are to get great people who can deliver great outcomes.
One of the things that we noticed through our venture arm is that, for example, we are invested in a venture fund in Bangladesh. And because they were so far behind in so many things, in certain circumstances, they've leapfrog us. And I'm thinking specifically of a state-of-the-art medical facility that is literally better than anything you can get here in New York City, which like blows my mind.
Yeah.
Is there any way that we could kind of look to those other innovations in other countries? I think also of former Eastern European companies that were under the thumb of communism, and suddenly that they're like the most modern forms of government. Any way to borrow techniques, ideas from them?
Yeah, I think to your example there, I think Estonia is often cited as like the world leader in digital democracy, digital tools, making it very easy to access and use government services. I think there's a lot to be learned there. Obviously, each country has its own institutional context, and so you have to make sure that you're learning from those lessons and then modifying them and adjusting them to the American context, the federal system of government, a lot of these services are either granted by the federal government, the money comes from the federal government, and then it's implemented at the state and local level. I like to keep that all in mind, which creates a lot of problems. But I do think there's large potential. And the one thing I would flag here is that this is actually an area where I'm very optimistic about artificial intelligence. I think what you see with AI is that it's very good at interacting with messy data and APIs that aren't well documented. It's good at trying something. If you have it set as an agent, it can iterate and try again until it succeeds. I think AI tools could make interfacing with government, especially if adopted by government agencies themselves, much easier to manage a lot of these processes. And so instead of trying to rebuild the entire platform or website for a given government agency, if we just create an AI tool that can interact with the underlying databases, with the browser interface, and you just set the goal, and it's a kind of an aid towards interacting with government services, I think we could make a lot of improvements there. And so I'm pretty optimistic that if AI tools are adopted, we could get much more efficient government services.
Yeah, I agree. We're also big investors in AI, in its various use cases. And one use case we thought of, a member of my team suggested, most researchers don't want to go after funding and or grant money to find something they know is a null set, right? So, but via Negativia, there's a lot of information in there that we don't know about. So what about simply programming an AI to generate hypothesis after hypothesis that is essentially a null set, but then going through in silico, going through all of that and publishing it to some huge database that scientists can make use of. I think that the number and breadth and depth of AI use cases is really staggering. How that's kind of the Platonic ideal.
Yeah.
How do we in the real world and messy world, how do we make sure that something like that type of interface actually gets pursued? You see what I'm saying? Because industry is going to be using it for sure. But government, that's a whole different kettle of fish. Do you have a position on how that could happen?
Yes, I think in terms of AI adoption in these areas, I agree there's a very large potential here. And again, I think AI is very good at ingesting large quantities of information, even unstructured data, and taking action based on that and making it legible when it's seemingly illegible. And so I think for government to adopt these tools, one, there needs to be just familiarity. So again, it's a talent question. Do we have the top people in government who understand what the best tools are to use and how to implement them? And there's a potential process for making this much more efficient. But the two caveats I would put here, the real bottlenecks that will be constraints in the long run, are where does AI interface with the real world? And so you mentioned in terms of scientific progress, in a lot of these areas, eventually you'll need to now you can't do everything in silico. You'll have to actually operate a lab. Okay. So how much of the lab environment can be automated? And once you have a human bottleneck, how do you unlock that bottleneck or automate more of the process? I think that will be a constraint as you try to do more things. And then more from the policy angle, I think the real bottleneck is often legal. It's risk of litigation. And we do a lot of stuff on permitting reform at IFP, permitting for building infrastructure in the real world. And really the main challenges you see there are around litigation. It's not only did you file your paperwork correctly and, these multi-thousand page environmental reviews, did you consider every alternative option? Did you consider every significant impact to the environment? But there are groups that are adversarial to you doing something. They are trying to use the court system to stop you from what you're doing. And I think this is where I kind of encourage people to have an AI skepticism of it can't solve everything, because even if the AI takes the paperwork part of this from 4 years to 1 year, and it can produce the multi-thousand page report much quicker than any human can, at the end of the day, if the laws in the books create a lot of tools for people who are anti-growth, people who want to be NIMBYs about building things in the real world, they still have the legal system, which is very slow, and our courts will not be adopting AI anytime soon. And so that's still a real bottleneck. So I think on the policy side, litigation and how these AI applications interface with our court system. And then on the scientific enterprise side, it's the real world, physical lab type issues, I think will also be a bottleneck, but lots of potential regardless.
Yeah, actually, another use case that we have for AI at OSV is we should set it on every single law currently on the books and find all of the antiquated, out of date, senseless, laws that were passed for a reason, keeping Chesterton's fence in mind, right? They might have been passed for a good reason back then, but, we don't go around on horses anymore. And then sort of putting up the list and kind of, I don't know, I don't want to use, shaming them into saying, okay, this is a really dumb law and we should take it off the books. But you bring up a really good point that I think about a lot, and that is the pessimistic purveyors of the precautionary principle, the NIMBYs. But they are not a tiny minority.
Yeah.
And so first off, I always try to understand things from other people's point of view. This is one that's hard for me to understand from other people's point of view, especially those that are actively against what we look at as progress and advancement. Do you have a skill set for interacting with those types of groups and at least getting them to consider your position?
Yes, I think I can answer this in two parts. One, first, setting aside can you persuade them argument, I think it's just really important to always remember that the effectiveness of opponents to growth and opponents to progress and change and dynamism, their success rate is highly contingent on the institutional context in which they operate and live. And so in a lot of other countries that don't share the US common law system, they don't have what scholars have called a adversarial legalism approach to the law, which means it's an open process led by plaintiffs who can bring claims from any direction. They fund their own lawsuits. And, there's a jury system that can be highly uncertain in terms of outcomes and how the law will be applied in different cases. The U.S. legal institutions create massive uncertainty and collectively at the local, state, and federal level lead to essentially a vetocracy. And so a loud minority, and I agree it's not zero, they are a significant minority, but they're a very loud and passionate minority, given current U.S. institutions, have an effective veto, where in other countries, through the democratic process, through any kind of public hearing or open input process, they would be heard. And then the majority or the large group that wants, the benefits of growth and the benefits of dynamism and building new infrastructure and things like that and housing, they would win out and the projects would be built, even if there was a loud vocal minority. So potential for institutional change to make it harder for them to win. Then in terms of actually addressing their concerns, I am somewhat sympathetic in a lot of cases that building things and change does impose very large, localized negative effects on certain people. And so, taking their concerns to heart and trying to address them as much as possible with policy or technology solutions, I think is a way forward here. So, for example, and just use housing as an example. When new housing is built, when multifamily, dense housing is built in an area with single family homes or just an area that hasn't undergone a lot of change recently, the primary concerns you hear are around noise and parking. Parking, there are literal, low-hanging solutions you could have here. You can allocate parking, on-street parking permits to incumbent residents and homeowners and say, the new people will not get parking permits, you get them because you are an incumbent. And that's a win-win because we'd rather have the big apartment building built and new people allowed to live there. And maybe if you give them parking permits, they will not yell so much at the local town council meeting. And then in terms of noise, I think this is where we're looking to do more research on this, is noise reducing innovations is a real thing. So noise is a real negative externality that bothers a lot of people. Construction is very loud by nature, but it doesn't have to be. For example, loud beeping when large trucks back up. There are other ways to ensure trucks don't crush people. Rear view cameras, white noise that is like less disruptive but still audible. There are just different ways to approach this that technology allows you to totally avoid the trade-off. And so we're constantly trying to act in good faith, take people's concerns at face value, and actually address them either with technology or with policy solutions. And I think that also gets you a long way in terms of reducing NIMBYism.
Another thing that I find fascinating about you is that you call yourself a Twitter first or social media think tank. What was the idea that sparked that as kind of a watchword or a catchphrase for your organization?
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation talking about what we viewed was kind of outdated or archaic about how DC think tanks have been operating, which is that we think the internet and social media is an information revolution and is disrupting a lot of industries and areas of life, but had left think tanks relatively untouched. A lot of think tanks in DC still operate on there's a researcher who's a quasi-academic who's in a room by themselves typing up very long white papers they publish once a quarter or once a year, and they print them out and they maybe at best walk around and drop them off in offices on Capitol Hill and no one reads them. And that's kind of the end of the story. And they have a press team that does comms, but they're weirdly not very good at it because they're not actually subject matter experts. And they have a separate government affairs team that is in a usually ham-fisted way trying to make connections and hand off relationships to the subject matter experts. But because they have the relationship, who knows where the trust goes or how effective it will be. And a big theory that we had when we started IFP, which I think has mostly been borne out, is that in the modern information ecosystem, what people want is for these things to be bundled into a single person on a narrow, and to do that feasibly has to be on a narrow issue topic. So you want the subject matter expert to be the one you have the relationship with when you're actually advocating in front of government. So they have to do their own government affairs, their own research, and because they're the subject matter expert, they have to be able to do their own comms. And that's on social media, that's writing, op-eds for publications, that's communicating with journalists, talking to them behind the scenes. And so when you bundle all those things together, I think you get much more effective kind of superstar policy wonks. They're rarer and harder to find, but those are the kind of people we try to only hire at IFP. And I think that is just a total disruption to the old way of doing things. And then lastly, I'll just add why Twitter first, why social media first. We realized that we want a barbell approach to policy where most of the discourse and policy action in public is discussed on Twitter. And sometimes in a neglected topic area, a white paper can be a difference maker. It can explain to the 10 people you need in government who actually do read things and actually are making decisions, what we should do on AI or what we should do in biotech. Those things sometimes are necessary, but usually it's either they're following the conversation on Twitter and that's where the Overton window is and that's where you can affect kind of a theory of change, or it's the deep research that sometimes is actually needed. But all the middle stuff of an op-ed in an outlet that no one reads, those are just kind of shouting into a void. And it's kind of scary. When you look at DC policy think tanks, there's a lot of that middle stuff where they're just talking to no one. And we try to focus on like, where is the conversation actually happening? Who's paying attention to what? And like, how do we influence that?
Yeah, I think Twitter is definitely a selling point in terms of all of these things. But then, of course, you also have the Twitterization of things, right? Like, so you've got EAC, you've got effective altruism. Do people confuse you with EAC or effective altruism, or are they pretty clear?
Yeah, I think it's a point of pride that we don't fit easily into any camp. I think at IFP, we want to be thought of as the innovation policy think tank in Washington, D.C. That is, in favor of progress and also understands that some technologies are riskier than others. And so I think that puts us in are they center left? Are they center right? Are they with EAC? Or are they with EA? I think we feel very comfortable, having connections to all those communities and trying to help them communicate with each other to find reasonable compromises and steps forward. And so that also, I think, helps us be more effective in Washington, D.C. is kind of sitting in the middle on those things and helping folks talk to each other.
So can you give me like maybe 3 examples? I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit about how you have to communicate differently in Washington as opposed to, say, Silicon Valley or New York City.
Yeah, so I think maybe a couple examples. So in Washington, D.C., they're very skeptical of techno-solutionism, of, let Silicon Valley rip, we got this handled. They're very skeptical of that. It's very national security mindset is very strong in Washington, D.C., much more so than other countries because of the scale of our military, global leadership of the U.S. And so I think in terms of technology and innovation issues, there's often a security mindset component in Washington, D.C. conversations that is not really happening in Silicon Valley, or it's much lower of a priority. And so I think the way we try to approach it is helping both sides recognize how they can benefit each other. And so helping people in Washington, D.C. recognize that the U.S. being a global leader in technology and innovation is an asset. And this is not an industry to be strangled. It's an industry to work with and partner with. U.S. soft power comes through being the global R&D lab. And the more we can do of that, the better we can benefit the entire world. And so helping those two sides talk to each other and recognize. And then conversely, I think for Silicon Valley and for New York City, there's often kind of a libertarian aspect to their approach of just like, leave us alone and we'll figure this out. And I think if more of those folks recognize the pervasiveness of market failures, they would do a lot better. Operation Warp Speed, for example, mRNA vaccines, there really was an extremely strong case for government to be the purchaser and guarantor of demand in that moment, because we've had previous pandemics and epidemics over the last few decades that, now looking back, we're like, we know that it lasted 3 years. But if you were a biotech pharma company in spring 2020, thinking about how much CapEx should I outlay as a company in terms of building factories and how many scientists should I employ to work on a COVID vaccine, if a variant occurred and the pandemic actually kind of sputtered out on its own in less than a year, you could have lost billions of dollars, and there would be no demand for your product if the pandemic kind of just resolved itself. And so in those situations, there are extremely large market failures and an extremely large role for government. And this is where we talk a lot about public-private partnerships. And if each side understands its role, you can get an amazing outcome like Operation Warp Speed. Should the government have had government employees be the ones designing the vaccine, building the factories, doing all this innovation work? We don't think that's the proper role for government. We think that's the proper role for the private sector and these risk takers, but also recognizing that market failures are a very real thing, especially with high uncertainty and long timelines. And so the government, through the demand channel, can shape what kind of innovations we get and how socially beneficial they are, because ending the pandemic early, literally Operation Warp Speed paid for itself if it had shortened the pandemic by 12 hours. I think arguably shortened it by months, if not years. And so the ROI on that kind of investment from the government and the way it changed the incentives of the private sector, I think is undeniably an amazing success.
Yeah. And the existence of the eternal existence of externalities really needs to be taken into account, because I love your example there. If you are the CEO of a biotech company and you're being held to a very different standard by your board of directors and shareholders, you're probably not going to make that huge investment. So I think that's an excellent example. What are you most excited about right now? What do you think through your work is maybe going to come about that wasn't going to come about before you guys came on the scene?
Yeah, I think I'm extremely excited. I think we're in the midst of multiple, arguably, revolutions in technology and innovation right now. So obviously, AI is potentially the most important technological change in history. We're in the midst of a biotech revolution. A lot of these technologies we're seeing, from CRISPR to mRNA, they're platform technologies and can be applied to a wide array of issues. And then, of course, arguably the largest priority of the Biden administration in terms of policy has been climate change and decarbonization and subsidizing and investing in clean technology. And so I would say the clean energy revolution, the biotech revolution, and the AI revolution are things that obviously are dramatically impacted by policy and something we're really excited to work on. And so for clean energy, it's all about permitting reform. How do we make it easier and faster to build infrastructure in the real world? In terms of biotech, we want much more certainty and shorter review times from the FDA, making it easier to actually bring drugs to market, and also incentivizing companies to work on technologies that are highly defensive in nature, things that in a future pandemic or a future crisis we would want to have invested in years before and not, start fresh each time. And then in terms of AI is a dual-use technology. There's amazing potential for it to revolutionize every aspect of our lives, to end diseases, as you mentioned, in terms of finding novel hypotheses and drug discovery, increasing worker productivity, economic growth, but also intelligence is extremely powerful as a tool. Intelligence is the reason that humans dominate the earth. And so we should be wary of just having this completely unchecked new technology as well. And so we often think about both accelerating scientific, technological, and industrial progress, but also shaping those technologies if they're dual use, and have both defensive and offensive applications. And so that's something that we're really excited to work on.
You've mentioned several times, and I agree with the notion that we in the United States are the world's R&D center. What would you say to critics who say, well, China seems to be doing a much better job at X, Y, or Z, and gosh, look at Singapore for such a tiny country. But how do you compare us to the efforts made by more authoritarian systems like China and to a lesser extent Singapore? Or do you just look and think, oh, there's some good ideas there, let's borrow?
Yeah, so we definitely think that we should and be learning from countries that are very successful. So, for example, the UK has made dramatic reforms to their high skilled immigration policy. Anyone who graduates from a top tier global university gets an automatic visa to the UK. I think that is a pro innovation policy that the US should be adopting as soon as possible. And we do a lot of work behind the scenes, both in Congress and the executive branch, to help make ideas like that happen. So we definitely should be learning from other countries on what works and doesn't work to accelerate innovation. But at the end of the day, we also shouldn't be too humble about the status of the U.S. and the importance of the U.S. in the world. I think we have no peer, and that is something that we should take pride in and not be complacent about. It should be something we double down on and view as a source of strength. So, for example, you mentioned Singapore. You also people mention Israel, maybe even Norway sometimes in terms of innovation per capita, scientific research per capita. But in this case, scale really matters, and quantity has a quality all of its own. And I think if you look at a lot of innovation is cluster based, you have to be in an ecosystem with both large universities, large research universities, and large large startups and private capital. And that's what you see in the Bay Area, in New York, in Austin, increasingly, other parts of the Northwest. Those unique factors all come together where you have public support for innovation, large sources of private capital, the most talented people in the world who are incentivized to take risk and rewarded for taking risk. And you don't see that combination in any other country in the world. And so China is very good at manufacturing, but they still cannot produce cutting edge semiconductor chips. They still cannot produce wide body aircraft. They cannot produce a lot of really cutting edge technology that is extremely complex and takes a long time to master. And so there's a potential they'll catch up. But in the meantime, they're still not at the frontier in most places. And like you've seen with AI, I think that's maybe the most telling thing is, I'm sure some of your listeners remember the conversation even just 2 or 3 years ago was, is China at parity with the United States in terms of AI? Baidu is poaching Google's AI head to come lead the Baidu AI team. How good are their machine learning models? Are we, in an arms race? And now I hear no one saying that they're anywhere close in terms of frontier models. And especially when paired with export controls, they don't have access to cutting edge chips. They have different incentives by not being an open democratic system. So the authoritarian leadership in China is very skeptical of a large language model that is very difficult to put guardrails on. And if you put any input through a probabilistic function produces some output that is very fuzzy, that does not sound like something that is controllable in a top-down sense, and they're very skeptical of. And so I think for inherent institutional reasons, and for reasons like TSMC is in Taiwan and ASML is in Europe, China is going to be very hard to catch up to the United States in that field. I think that applies to a lot of different areas of the frontier.
Yeah, and obviously, noting that confirms all of my priors, I definitely think that open systems be closed, and that cognitive diversity and the ability to draw on minds with very different ways of looking at the world is, how much is the internet driven by open source software? It's like some huge percentage. And then, if you want to take a stab at could we come up with a fictional treatment where large language models literally are the downfall of all the authoritarian societies? I mean, I'd watch that. Well, Alec, this has been amazingly fun. I love the work that you're doing. I do have one last question before we get to the ultimate last question. I agree with you wholeheartedly that we are sort of the epicenter. And what can we do to hasten government waking up to the fact, like the UK? Why are we not stapling green cards to every advanced degree in let's just limit it to STEM. In every advanced degree given from the institutions here? It seems to me to be the height of madness to allow people to come to our great universities from all around the world, get the greatest education in the world, and then throw them out. That makes no sense to me. Yes. How do we figure that out?
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you. I think this is a really important, message that I want to share, because I think this has changed in recent years. The reason why this policy has not passed, more than 3 or 4 years ago, the answer to this, it was true for multiple decades, was that Democrats were not interested in having just high-skilled immigration reform that was targeted at STEM immigrants or people with advanced degrees, because they wanted comprehensive immigration reform. They wanted to tie low-skilled and high-skilled together. And so Republicans would say, we just want to focus on employment-based immigration and skill-based immigration. And Democrats would say, let's fix family-based, let's fix low-skilled, let's do all of it together. And so I think they were the effective veto point on immigration reform up until recent years. A very telling thing happened during the debate on the CHIPS and Science Act in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. The House passed their version of CHIPS and Science, was called the America Competes Act. And in that bill that passed the Democratic House, because it was in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, that bill included a green card cap exemption for anyone with an advanced STEM degree, either master's or PhD. And that was a partisan bill that passed the Democratic House with almost exclusively Democratic votes. So we have now an existence proof that Democrats will vote for in the context of a CHIPS and Science bill. How do we make the U.S. strong on technology, innovation, and science? Democrats voted for just a high-skilled immigration reform. And Senate Republicans were the veto point. A few Senate Republicans were the veto point on that topic, and that's why it was not included in the final Chips and Science Act that was signed into law. So I think a lot of folks who might have blamed Democrats in the past for not making progress on this obvious low-hanging fruit, how are we not doing this, as you described it, now it's a primary issue for Republicans. By that I mean like their election primaries. Like a Republican, given how controversial the broad topic of immigration is within the Republican Party, they are worried about taking any vote that increases any amount of immigration, potentially the United States, because they are worried they're going to get primaried by far-right Republican candidate and they'll lose their seat in office. And so you hear things like research security concerns of, if we open up immigration, will China send spies to the United States and steal our intellectual property? We think there are keyhole solutions to address many of these. Like, what if we opened up STEM immigration to anywhere but China? You can how are your concerns now about research security? Or you can think of things like, let them immigrate to the United States, but they can't work in sensitive sectors. They can't obviously get security clearances. That should address a lot of concerns. Are we doing rigorous security checks and background screenings on these people? Let's do all of that. So there are ways to address the direct concerns they have, but also in a certain sense, given the Republican Party's feelings on immigration today, legislative progress is very difficult. I think if we get a border security bill, that could change over time. Depending on the outcome of the election in November, the Republican Party could change again. And then maybe to end this one on a note of optimism, the executive branch, outside of the number of green cards, has a lot of discretion on uncapped temporary visas in terms of the number of people we bring to the United States and how much certainty we can give them of like, what are your odds of getting one of these temporary visas? How easy is it to renew that temporary visa? Do you need to fly home and go to the consulate there, or can you renew it online or from somewhere within the United States? All of those things really matter on the margin and totally neglected, basically uncontroversial because they are process reforms. But that does still directly lead to having some of the smartest people in the world in the United States for longer. And so we also do a lot of work on that and see a lot of potential and progress there.
Great stuff, Alec. Where can everyone find you?
Yeah, so our website is ifp.org. If you search Institute for Progress or IFP, you'll find our Twitter account, our website, and yeah, we publish a lot. Have a great list of experts on every topic from meta science, high-skilled immigration, infrastructure, AI, biotechnology, and so we'd love to have folks interact with our work and happy to chat with anyone.
Terrific stuff. I will take a look and see what I can do to help support you. I think anything that is working towards what I think can be an amazing era coming up should be supported fully. Well, if you've seen or listened to the podcast before, you know that our final question is a speculation, really. We are going to wave a wand and we're going to make you the emperor of the world. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is we're going to hand you a magical microphone, and you can speak two things into it that will incept all 8-odd billion people in the world when they wake up, whenever their morning is the next day. The two things that you've incepted in them, they're going to think, I just had the two best ideas I've ever had in my life, and I'm going to act on them from right now going forward. What two things are you going to incept in the world?
I think the first one I would incept in the world is that openness to new people and new experiences is a positive. I think a lot of that, we talk about this conversation, where does NIMBYism come from? Where does xenophobia come from? It's mostly fear of change. And I think in most cases, unmerited fear of change. And as you see change happen, you realize that there are much larger benefits that outweigh the costs. And a dynamic society is much more interesting and fulfilling to live in than a stagnant, sclerotic society. And so I'd say, in terms of you think of like the big 5 traits, the ocean test of like openness to new experiences, I would just ratchet everybody up of like, I feel more open to new people, new experiences, new things. I think that's an essential part of living in a dynamic society. And then I would say the secondary thing, and I'll use this one just because I believe in the housing theory of everything. Our friends at Works in Progress magazine have a central piece of reading that housing policy is critical and upstream of almost everything we care about, because if you have abundant, affordable housing, it allows people to live where they want to live, access new labor markets, cluster in different ways that lead to more innovation, growth, and dynamism. And so the idea I would incept in people's brains is that dense multifamily housing is good for this neighborhood and good for this country. And so if every major area of high opportunity built a lot more housing around the world, all major cities are the most productive geographic areas in our world. And so if we have more people move to opportunity and be afford to live there and not spend a third of their paycheck, I think that would be a great idea if everyone supported more dense housing.
Amen to both of those. You can't build a human colossus if people don't have anywhere to live.
Exactly.
Well, Alec, thank you so much for coming on. Best of luck. And we love what you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Jim. It's great.